explain a little better this terms of trade argument. You know, there'll be an exam question, which is explain carefully how state capitalist industry got extra resources to fund its expenditures by turning the terms of trade against the agents. Explain that. So what do you do? And then I'm going to go through again the importance of this. Let's take, I'll do it with an example. I hope this works. Let me take an ancient farmer, a farmer who's involved in the ancient fundamental class process, which means that she appropriates his or her own surplus. So that's where most of the population lived and worked in the 1920s under the new economic policy that Lenin instituted to deal with the crisis of world communism. And as I explained to you, he reintroduced private markets, which now operated along with state markets. He allowed net and private merchants to operate along with state merchants. He allowed the buying and selling of labor power in agriculture, which had been abolished under world communism. And he allowed the farmers to lease new lands in agriculture from other farmers. So he reintroduced many of the market incentives that have been abolished, and to a degree he allowed private property and land in the agricultural sector in order to deal with the contradictions of world communism. Okay, so we have ancients, these ancient farmers, and they can sell their commodities. I'm going to deal with grain. They can sell their grain. That's the most important crop in the Soviet Union. That's what the bread is made out of. That's the staple, the most important part of the diet of the Russians then and now. They can sell their grain for whatever the market price is. And if the state puts a low market price, which it can do on the state market, then as you nicely explained to me, what the farmer will do, the agent, is go from the state market to the free market and sell that grain at a higher price. And so the state then is forced to continually adjust its grain price to the higher private market. And as another person said, you can have arbitrage. That is, you can have some individuals, and those with net, they might buy the grain on a state market at a low price and resell the grain at a higher price on the free market. Okay, suppose the ancients, or let's set it up. Suppose it takes, for these ancient farmers, suppose it takes 4 hours of their labor to produce 2 units of grain. And I'm going to assume that every hour, 1 hour of labor is equal to 1 ruble. Let's make life easy for myself. So the ancients put in 4 hours of their labor to produce 2 units of grain. So I'm going to put here for the ancient, so this is 4 hours, okay, of labor that they're putting in. This is the total value of the ancient. This is the number of units of grain. Let's say 2 units of grain. I always call this the number of use values. The things, 2 units of grain. And suppose they pay themselves 2, and they, as individuals, get 2 units of labor, or $2 rubles, for themselves as their profits. So they're in the position to receive the profits that they produce. Their labor yields 4 rubles. They pay themselves wages of 2, and they get the profits themselves as individuals of 2 rubles. But let's also assume that they need all kinds of fertilizers, and tractors, and so forth, etc., seeds, blah, 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 to produce the grain. It's not just by labor itself. And suppose all that stuff costs 4 rubles, or 4 hours. In other words, in the background, there's the state capitalist industry producing these goods, fertilizers, tractors, tools, equipment, and they sell their goods to these farmers for 4 rubles. Why? Because it takes 4 rubles to produce them. In the background is a C, B, S that adds up to 4. So the total cost of grain for these 2 units is 8 rubles. Okay, what does that mean? I'm just reviewing what we've done before. That means when an ancient farmer goes to the market and sells, whether it be in the state market or the private market, that farmer wants 8. Why? Because that'll cover his or her costs of 6 and allow this farmer to realize a profit of 2. So the total value of the 2 units, once again, is 8. You cover the costs of 4, 6, 8. Okay. You sell it at 8, you cover your costs of 6, and you get 2 of profits. Who gets it? 2. The individual farmer. The rate of profit here for this farm is, let's see, it's 2 over 6. So the rate of profit is 33.33%. Hefty rate of profit. Any questions on this? It's a review, but it's okay. And you had, I don't know, God knows how many, maybe 100 million farmers, maybe more. The mass of the population were doing this. Because of NEP, instituted by Lenin, suppose it were the case that this farmer sells the same grain, not for 8, which he would like to do, be perfectly happy, but rather sells it for 20. What that means is that you go to the grain market, whether it be the state supply of grain, the demand for grain. The supply of grain comes from these agents. You add them all up. So that's the supply, the little s, that's the supply that gives you the big S of all these grain farms. The demand for grain is from some farmers and a lot of workers who are working in Moscow, and they don't produce grain. They produce tools and clothing and so forth. They get their grain from agriculture, from the ancients. And because industrialization is moving very rapidly, blah, 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 the demand is shifting to the right. This is the new. And the price of grain, instead of being 8 divided by 2, that's 4. The price, instead of a unit of grain being 4, suppose it's 10. Questions on this? So this is what a market does. Okay? If it's a free market, which it was, then the price of grain is going to go up. And the farmer can sell his 2 units for 20, 10 times 2. Because he's producing 2 units of grain. So if you reestablish this free market, then the market determines the price. That's what markets mean. Supply and demand. And again, the state market has to continually adjust. It always lags behind. The planners are continually making mistakes, but it has to adjust. Otherwise, the farmer will not sell the grain on the state market. Will go to the free market and sell for 20. This farmer, and by token, 100 million of them, are as happy, as a pig in land. These are happy ancient farms. Why? Well, they can sell their grain now for 20 rather than 8. They sell all their grain for 20 rather than 8. So they enjoy a tremendous increase in revenues. They have a surplus value of 2. That hasn't changed. But now they get a non-class revenue. Nothing to do with class exploitation. It's just that the market this thing over here. The market has changed, enabling them to sell their grain for more, much more than it costs. Rather than selling it for 4, they can sell it for 10. Okay? So they get a non-class revenue here of much more than they did before. Their total profits remain 14. That is, they sell for 20. They have costs of 6. So they sell the 2 units of grain. 10 times 2, 20. They have costs of 6 for the 2 units. So they get an extra of 14 rubles because of what the market, an extra profits of 14, 12 plus 2, because of what the market delivers to them. So their rate of profit now is, in the new situation, is 14 divided by 6. 12 is 2 6. Wow! Their rate of profit is 233%. Why?
Well, because the state-controlled previous market
Can't
their costs didn't adjust,
Their costs stay the same.
but because of the free market.
Because, okay, just easy. So that's what a free market can give them. You talk about incentives. Their profit rate went from 33, in my crazy example, to 233% overnight. Would they be happy? Yes. These are happy individuals. Questions? Next. That's on the output side. That's how the market, that's how the unions benefited from NEP, New Economic Policy, from the recreation of market. On the buying side, because these ancients can't produce grain with only labor. They need means of production. In order to produce grain, you need equipment, fertilizers, raw materials. If you have a tractor, you need fuel, and the tractor itself, you need a whole bunch of raw materials. You know that. You go visit any farm in this part of Massachusetts, you look at the fields, you don't just see the farmer and the farmer's family, you see all kinds of rusted crap sitting in the fields. The means of production that are used to produce the agricultural goods. Suppose then on the buying side, we have the following. Okay, so I'm going to erase this. The ancient has that surplus, that's the profit. Got to make all kinds of distributions out of the profit to maintain the ancient status, not the least of which is taxes to the state and so forth. But there's something new that arises under the NEP. The new one, by the ancient, is a payment that has to be made to state capitalist industry. And it's this one over here that turns out to be a disaster to the ancients. What is it? Well, on this one, on the buying side, so this is all the payments that have to be made to purchase the means of production at higher and higher market prices. So what the state capitalists do, the planners do, instructed by the state capitalists themselves, just a few individuals, is to charge farmers higher and higher prices for the goods that the state capitalists produce, above and beyond their costs. So the cost of fertilizer, of trucks, of equipment, all kinds of raw materials and so forth increase in the farm. This will be quite high. So, let me write it down. Make sure. To the state capitalist industry. So these are payments made by the ancients to state capitalist industry. If this is, what number did I use here? If this is 12 minus 4, okay, so what is this 12? This is the price of the inputs, and the state has the power, the state capitalists have the power to raise this. It's not a market there. They just raise the price. This is the exchange value per unit use value of the C good. This is the price of the inputs. So whatever was the cost, they raise it above and beyond that. If this is 2 bags of fertilizer, if they have to pay 12 rubles for the bag, and it only costs 8 for that, then on the cost side, they have 16 rubles that they have to pay above and beyond what they were paying before. So they get a net gain of 12 rubles on the selling side, but they have to pay 16 on the buying side. This is a disaster. On net, they're worse off. And the way that this is captured in this literature, this is very famous, is that the terms of trade turn against the ancient farmers. But what it says is that the price of grain, that's the benefit of the farmers, that's on their output side, that's what they're selling, relative to the price of the inputs, manufactured inputs by state capitalism. Price of grains sold by ancients, the ancient farmers, by ancients. So this goes up, but this goes up by even more, as I just showed you, 16 rubles. And hence, the ratio turns against agriculture. And that 4 extra rubles, okay, that 16 minus 12, that 4 extra that the state capitalists get by selling their goods for more than what they're worth, that 4 extra, that's the extra resources squeezed out of agriculture. And those extra resources, multiplied by millions of units of grain and every other crop, goes to finance the expansion of state capitalist industry at the expense of these ancient farms. So, from last time, where I ended up, you had surplus value in this state capitalist industry. So this is industry. Then you had this, I don't know what you would call it, terms of trade effect. This terms of trade effect over here. This rip-off of agriculture, squeezing the ancients, getting that extra 4. And that helped to finance, these new expenditures in state capitalism. And I mentioned to you 3. 1, industrialization, state bureaucracy, and military groups. Now you know, how did the right-hand side grow in the 1920s? By not just exploitation, but this squeezing of extra resources out of agriculture, which bumped the right-hand side. And in particular, these are the 3 that grew rapidly. A bureaucrat that as 1,000 bureaucrats had to figure out what we just did in class. Somebody had to do that. The only reason I could do it is because someone did it before me. So they had to figure this out. Someone sat down and figured out how the hell do you squeeze agriculture? How do you do this? In this way. Question? Yes, real lobster.
I just have a question about the last three that you put on the board there.
This one?
Yes.
Military.
Yeah, just the last three.
So industrialization. So the capital accumulation expanded rapidly in agriculture, in industry, because they had the extra resources to do that now. So with 4 more units of grain, they could employ more people, feed them, hire more managers to oversee state capitalism and establish and equip a military goods industry. Let's be, I'm going to come to it and I'm going to repeat again. We're going to get angry farmers. Is there any way you can think of that you can offset the angry farmers, the ancients, by expanding this? Be sophisticated now. You've got angry farmers, and they're the majority of the population. Is there any way you can offset, deal with their anger? You're not going to squeeze them! Any way to offset that? You think of anything? Yeah.
Two.
What?
2 ways. You could either employ them, or you could put police near them.
Take 2 ways. Number one, you can deal with their anger by putting police there. Okay? Perhaps police that you don't see, so they could be secret police. Number one. And number two, you don't employ them. It's even more genius. Because you need them to be farmers.
Other families.
You got it. So you hire their children in the state bureaucracy at good paying jobs. So even though they get squeezed, like people like always do, at least my children will have a better life. Because my children will be here. They'll be the engineers, the economists, and so forth that will manage state capitalism. Good for you, man. This is exactly what they did. So they sacrificed for their children, just like your parents. Okay, one last part of this. Not only did the state capitalists, that is, the state capitalists, and again, just a few ministers did this, not only did they squeeze the agricultural sector in this way, but they also sold wage goods to the ancients at higher and higher prices. So, to go back, the ancients had a value, they paid themselves a wage of 2 rubles. The problem was that the prices on manufactures that were sold to these people kept going up. And hence, the real wage, do this again, we've done it before, the real wage was constrained because the state capitalists kept raising the prices of shirts and shoes and so forth. So the 2 rubles were not sufficient to maintain the standard of living because the state capitalists had the power to, and they did. They raised their prices. So you had 2 ways to squeeze the ancient farmers. Again, the majority of the population. One way was to raise the prices of the inputs of the means of production that they were using. Okay? And the second way was to raise the prices of the consumer goods that they tried to buy. You can bet that these ancients are angry. They're upset because they're getting squeezed in these 2 different ways. And their life is becoming precarious. And they still remember the revolution. The revolution, don't forget, was an alliance between these ancients and the workers. And now it looks as if the workers are benefiting at the expense of the ancients, and that was part of the very revolution that occurred. The kulaks in agriculture. Okay, let's go back and get those farmers. Those ancients that began to go into small capitalism by hiring labor power and leasing more lands and becoming small capitalists in agriculture, they too are being constrained by what state capitalism is doing. They have the same problem. They're facing higher prices on manufacturers for what they need for their capitalist farms, and they also have higher prices on the goods that they are purchasing. So the kulaks, who are enterprising farmers, a little bit more enterprising than the ancients because they're hiring labor power and they're getting the surplus, they too face a problem in terms of running profitable farms. So you have a crisis for both the ancients and for these small capitalist farmers, these kulaks. And the resources taken from them are used to finance state capitalist industry. The vast of the population is being squeezed for the benefit of capitalism. And that's going to build that pressure. Finally, I just want to tell you one comment, because you may not know this, so let me just add the following, okay? What I just explained to you, okay, this turning of the terms of trade against this agriculture to benefit industry is actually very famous in the literature in economics. And you may have run into this in other courses, so I want to tie it to that if you did. There was a man long ago, an economist, very famous. His name was Raoul Prebisch. Raoul Prebisch, P-R-E-B-I-S-C-H. Raoul Prebisch was an economist from Argentina, if I remember correctly. And he was commissioned to write a report for the League of Nations, that which preceded the United Nations. And he wrote this report just before World War II, if I remember correctly. And what he showed in that report was that what happened after 1870, up until the war broke out, just before the war, through the 1930s, what happened was that the terms of trade between the industrial North, that is the great capitalist industrial nations, and the raw material producing and food producing nations of the South, Latin America, Asia, Africa, and so forth, the terms of trade had turned against the third world in favor of the first. What that means, in terms of what I just explained to you, that resources were drawn out of the poorest parts of the world and used to fund the richest part of the world. That was a very controversial report by Mr. Raoul Prebisch. And he became a very, very famous economist, not so much here, but in the third world. Because what he showed was how their relative underdevelopment was a result of the development of the industrial countries. That's how provocative it was what he did. So that's a relationship between, in the world, in terms of what we just did. There was a man who came along after Raoul Prebisch. His name was, he soon passed away, Maurice Dobb, D-O-B-B. He was a British economist. And what Dobb did was take Raoul Prebisch's analysis and apply it inside the Soviet Union. So what he said about the Soviet Union is that the relationship between state capitalism, industry, and the ancients' agriculture was a kind of internal colonialism, I quote, in which the center, industry, used its power to manipulate the terms of trade against the hinterland, the agricultural sector within the former Soviet Union, and drained resources from it. So it's a famous example in economics, sometimes taught in economic development, I guess. Okay, questions on this? Okay, you got a lot? Yes, sir.
Just out of curiosity. So, brought up how the way to deal with angry farmers partially is by hiring their children for state jobs.
Yeah.
Who then becomes the farmers of the next generation?
It's a good question. There's an economics answer, okay? Let me do the United States. We start out in the United States, 90% of the people are in agriculture, 10% are in industry. We end up with less than 10% in agriculture and everybody else working in industry. And we have so much food, we throw it away. So how do you explain that?
Increased productivity.
That's the answer. You get an A. Give him an A. That's the answer. You understand the importance of an increase in productivity? That'll shift the supply of food continually to the right. And the last thing on this. In the United States, we have a very successful, historically, agricultural sector in grains. The price of grain goes up. The price of manufacturers does not increase as much. The terms of trade move in favor of the farmer, roughly from the 1830s on. So it's not a controlled market. It's more or less a free market in the United States. The price of grain takes off with our great industrialization in the United States. Okay. And the flourishing of industry, there's a lot of competition. To make a long story short, the terms of trade move in favor of the farmers. They are ancients. And the most famous example is in corn production. It's all ancients then and today. Very little capitalism. What happens in the United States? Can you figure that out? What we've done? What do you think in terms of what you just said?
Well, they start overproducing.
Huh?
They start overproducing.
Can you create a story about American agriculture which is different from the story that I told you for the Russian, for the Soviet Union, in which you get a different result in the United States? The terms of trade are moving in favor of the farmers. Here they're moving against. So the farmers are doing well. What happens? The prices are going up for corn. The farmers are happy, and it doesn't turn into a disaster because the stuff that they're buying, the fertilizers, blah, 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 that's not rising as fast. And all the consumer goods, the prices there actually fall. The price of clothing starts to fall. The harnesses start to fall. Yes? Yes, they buy more means of production. Their profit rate is going up, continues to go up. It doesn't turn down. Their profit goes up. Okay? They start to purchase more means of production. And how does that affect their farm?
It starts to grow.
But what grows? I understand I'm being dumb. Their output grows. Their corn production grows. The supply curve of corn shifts to the right. Because the productivity, what you said, the productivity of the labor takes off. They start buying machines. They discover that they can raise their productivity even more if they have a truck and if they have a tractor instead of a horse. New kinds of fertilizer, new education. The Big Ten schools teach agronomy and so forth to these people. To the kids go back to the farms. So the technological revolution, as well as raising the composition of capital, the supply curve shifts to the right. It's unbelievable. In fact, it's so successful that everybody leaves the farm and they come to the cities. And the price of food then starts to fall. Because this story of agricultural success in the U.S., which is the opposite of this, turns out to be so successful for the ancient corn farmer, and they compete so much amongst themselves that the price of corn falls dramatically. So the price of corn in the U.S. is the cheapest price of corn in the entire world by the turn of the 1900s. And the farmers then leave corn production, or the kids leave, and come into the cities to sell their labor power. So it's a very different story. By the way, this is a trivia. Who sells the farmer new means of production and consumables? I actually really do mean who. complete this, because this is on television. You'll see this stuff on TV, so you might as well connect it to what we do in class. Yeah.
Sears.
Absolutely. Good use. Sears Roebuck. Sears Roebuck becomes the most important private merchant that takes the products produced in the eastern capitalist factories, in the northeastern capitalist factories, and the midwestern capitalist factories. It's located in Chicago, you know. And Sears then, as I mentioned to you before, then it, it's the Walmart of its day. It then produces a catalog that I described to you, in which all this stuff is listed, and the farmers then sell their products and can then buy from the catalog all the new means of production and the wage goods, and they therefore have an incentive to expand their hobby. And it's a successful ancient in form, but not necessarily in other ways. Anyway, so successful that eventually corn is so cheap that the state has to come in and increase the price of corn in the United States. Government support programs. That's how successful it is. Okay. Other questions on this? On the former Soviet Union? Yes, sir.
Is it possible that the increase in productivity that happened in corn and stuff, for example, in the United States, that is forcing population of whatever country to work less?
Well, how does that go? You mean in the United States?
Yeah, or the USSR.
I'm sure. I didn't get the logic.
So, like, technology is taking over the labor that a human might do?
Well, I mean, that's what you just described is what happened in U.S. agriculture. So the productivity went up via new technology, new ways of growing corn. The most dramatic revolution in the U.S. case is this new seed grains. I can't remember the name of the chemical company. Monsanto produced new seeds, okay? And the new seeds that they produce enabled the productivity to just take off. And that, therefore, well, go ahead.
So at some point, is the productivity so high that people just don't have jobs? They don't have.
Yes, and so they migrate. That's not the only reason. So people leave agriculture because of what you just described.
But even in industry, I'm saying, because like industry kind of supplements with their technology, they give it back.
It's quite possible. Right? Yes, it's quite possible. But I don't want to reduce it, just to this economics, because people have always been leaving agriculture. Because everybody's attracted by city lights. So, I think you all appreciate this even more than I do. You don't want to get stuck in a rural area without all the amenities of city lights. And so people, not just for economic reasons, they leave because they're attracted to what a city offers them, which is a different kind of life. But you're quite right, and it can happen in industry as well. Yes?
What pushed the prices up initially? What eventually pushed
In the
prices
US?
up? Yeah.
What would you guess?
Cost of input.
But stop. You got demand and supply. Stop it. So what shifts the demand for grain to the right? After the Revolutionary War, after the two wars against the British, starting around the 1830s, continuing all the way through and after the Civil War. What increases the demand for for cotton, tobacco, grains, sugar, beet sugar, cane sugar too, I guess, yeah?
Having to pay for your labor.
Okay. The demand shifts to the right because this is a period of rapid industrialization in the United States. So you're employing more and more people in industry to produce all these manufacturers, and those people have to eat. And so they're no longer in agriculture, so the way to deal with that is to have a rising productivity. As you shift labor from agriculture to industry, then you need a rising productivity in agriculture. And then those people who are specializing in industry, then they can buy their food from this increasingly productive agriculture. And capital accumulation is rapidly growing in industry. Exports are growing, blah, 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 blah. So this is the dynamic capitalism of the United States. K-Star, that land of capital accumulation, and everything else is taken off. Interrupted just a little bit by the Civil War. So your question comes under, it's not discourse, it comes under, how do you kind of make a relationship between agriculture and industry to kind of balance this out so it doesn't get out of whack? Okay, ready? For what the reasons I gave you, and no doubt other reasons as well, the NEP increasingly is falling apart because of what I just told you. These ancient farmers, these kulaks in agriculture, are recalcitrant, unhappy, angry, because they're getting squeezed in these two ways. The prices of their inputs keep rising, and the prices of the goods that they want to purchase keep rising. Let me even add another one to that, since it's part of the literature, on this last point. It's not just that the prices of the consumer goods are rising to them, creating this problem over here, depressing their real wage, their standard of living. But the goods that are in the state stores and the private stores, the stuff that they, the boots, the radio, and all that stuff, fall apart. It's part of the story here. They're increasingly facing shoddy goods that don't work at high prices. So the boots fall apart. The gloves don't work. After a week, they fall apart. So it's not just that you have to pay high prices for this stuff. The stuff stinks. Much of the energy of this industrialization is directed to the production of heavy industry capital goods. It goes back to the singles. You've got to develop the forces of production. And the Russians deliberately neglect the production of consumer goods. They reallocate more and more resources here to the production of machinery and, of course, tractors. And fewer, and they neglect the production of consumer goods. So that creates a famine in manufacturers. You can have a grain famine, you can have a famine in manufactured goods. And then the goods that they produce are produced under their shoddy goods. So the farmers have three problems. High prices of inputs, high prices of consumer goods, and lousy consumer goods. What do the farmers need? Boots. They need gloves. They need pants. They need shirts. What do they do?
Tell their wife to get busy.
That's an A+ for you, man. I can't do better than that. Okay, that's one of those moments I should just be silent. So, what happens is, in the ancients, in the farmers, they need boots. So increasingly, they begin to buy their boots and their clothing and even their farm implements from within the rural area themselves. And what starts to grow in the 1920s are small, ancient, and capitalist enterprises in the rural areas producing that stuff at much cheaper prices and of better quality. Number one. Number two, increasingly within the households, women start producing more and more what they always produced, which was clothing and candles and so forth, etc. It's called rural industry, which has always been the province of households. And in this particular case, increasingly women are not going in the farms as they did in the United States. Rather, they're staying in the household, producing all their stuff to be used as consumer goods and sometimes even as means of production. So you have a growth of manufacturing in the rural areas. Under the ancient, the capitalist, and I can't do this, but there's not enough time. There are some Soviet feminists who come along during this period of time, a very radical group, and they claim that this growth of household production was a growth of feudalism in the household. It was a feudal relationship between the man and the woman. They're very famous for doing this, for studying this. So paradoxically, you have an emergence of feudalism in this so-called socialist We have then the crisis of NEP. We have the ancients, the capitalist farmers, and now these new, let's use them, these ancient and these capitalist producers of manufacturers in the agricultural sector. We have all of them experiencing difficulty because the terms of trade are moving against them, albeit it's true that the small manufacturers in the rural areas are doing a bit better than the farmers. And increasingly, the ancient farmers in the kulaks start to hold back in their grain supply because it makes no sense for them. They're getting killed. They're losing on every sale. That is, they're losing on net by engaging in this grain farming, number one. Number two, there's two kinds of agricultural goods that are important. There's grain, and now let me introduce the other one. There's everything else. Like what? Well, like cotton, beet sugar, tobacco. These also are terribly important products. And here what happens is that the state very carefully allows the prices of these other products, these raw materials, to increase very rapidly, just like on the private markets. It doesn't interfere with them at all. And the farmer notices that he or she can do much better by producing a raw material, say beet sugar, than by producing grain. So what happens over the 1920s is more and more farmers, to survive, move their resources from the production of food items like grains to the production of cotton, tobacco, and raw material. That reduces the supply of grain. And that compounds the very problem that we're talking about. Why? Because the price of grain starts to go up in the cities. And then the workers there who require grain have to pay higher and higher prices. And the only way they can do that is to have higher wages, but the state capitalists do not want to give them higher wages, so there's pressure on the real wage in the cities. So the problem in agriculture gets also creates a new problem in industry. And what the state capitalists discover that they're not only going to get a revolt in agriculture, but they're going to get a revolt in industry because the price of food keeps rising. And so they keep on paying the workers higher money wage to compensate for the higher price of grain, of food, of bread. And in so doing, their profits are less than they would be otherwise. And that restrains this and forces them to do more. This is crazy. This is out of control. Next, as I mentioned to you, there is a particular problem in 1927, okay, which is there's a lousy weather supply. The weather is lousy, so the supply of grain falls, which compounds. It's a crisis. It's called a grain crisis. And in response to that, what the planners do is reduce the price of grain. It's the opposite of what they should do. And so by reducing the price of grain, these ancients and these kulaks, they just eat the grain. Or they feed it to their animals and then they eat the animals. So the marketable supply of grain in the cities goes down even more. The price of grain takes off. And now there's the looming starvation in the cities as well. In the late 1920s, Stalin reacts to all of this, as I mentioned to you before. He notices that over the 1920s, that the terms of trade effect is diminishing. They're able to squeeze, they're still squeezing, but they're squeezing less and less from agriculture because of these contradictions of the very squeezing of agriculture. So he notices that the farmers are responding by producing and selling less grain. Cotton goes up, beet sugar goes up, as the farmers reallocate, but they're producing less and less grain, and he's got on his hands a looming problem with these industrial workers. The other half, the other half, the hammer and sickle. Okay? So, one possibility out of this, which they do a little bit, is they begin to tax everybody to raise more revenues to finance this. The other thing is they can get foreign loans. But no one's going to lend to them, because no one's going to. The industrial capitalist world is not going to lend to communism. So he's in kind of a bind. And what he does is what I explained to you last time, very famous. He eliminates the kulaks and the ancients. I don't know how else to describe it. So what happens here is a revolution in agriculture in which Stalin launches what is called by historians, by the former Soviets, the collectivization of agriculture. The state, but let me just add to it now. This is now 1928, 29, and then all the way through the 30s. It really takes off in the 30s. So what the state now does, or what the state capitalists do, is they eliminate all the private markets. All private markets are eliminated. This is all part of collectivization. So they eliminate anything. Private markets are eliminated, and we only have state markets. All netmen are eliminated. We only have state merchants and state stores across across the Soviet Union. No more buying and selling of labor power in agriculture. No more leasing of land in agriculture. So all markets, input and output, become planned. So it's the reintroduction of full state planning, as it was under war communism. And the NEP is completely dismantled. This is coupled with the collectivization of agriculture. The state uses local officials in the rural areas and the army, and he sends, Stalin sends in these officials, state officials, to literally bring all the ancient farms together into one farm. I don't mean one farm across, obviously, this land, but you go to a region and you have 1,000 ancient farms. You make those people bring together, that's what collectivization means. You collectivize them, you bring together all those farmers into one farming unit. And labor there is to be performed no longer individually, as it was, but rather collectively. The means of production, the animals, the land, and so forth, has to be owned by the collectivity, no longer by the ancient. That's been abolished. The grains produced and the value of the grains sold on state markets, that's all to remain in the hands of the collectives. So these are all new laws that are passed. The collective owns the means of production. When the collective sells its grain to the state, then the rubles that the collective receives is to be deposited in the hands of the collective. And the farmers, the collective farmers, personify the collective. That's who gets the money. The idea is as follows, that if you bring together all these ancients, you get economies of scale and the productivity of labor will go up. That's one goal. Number two, Stalin also, and I'm going to come to it again, but there's another reason the productivity of labor will go up. Stalin also is going to supply new tractors to these collectives. So for now, which did not happen under NEP, but now tractors are going to be given to these collectives to raise the productivity of labor. Third, all kinds of farming rules are established to raise the productivity of labor. And so the idea is if you raise the productivity of labor in agriculture, you're going to reduce the unit value of food, and hence you'll reduce the value of labor power in industry. And you'll get rid of that problem. You'll also get rid of the problem of the angry, recalcitrant ancients and small kulaks. Some ancients and kulaks resist. In fact, many of them resist. They don't like this idea at all. And as I said to you before, Stalin then uses these state officials and these soldiers to force the ancients, those that resist, into the collectives. And if you resist the force, then you can be shot. Many were shot. Many were sent to Siberia, which is very cold. And no one knows exactly how many former ancients and kulaks were dealt with this way, but I can tell you, having studied it for many years, the estimates range anywhere from 8 to 10 million. So that's a lot of people that disappeared. Okay. So you had these collectives then established across the former Soviet Union. And in those collectives, in grain, sugar beets, and all raw materials and so forth, etc., the new rules of the game, the politics, the culture, and the economics was that the individuals who were members of the collective had the right to appropriate and distribute their surplus. This was the establishment of a communist fundamental class process in the 20th century on a vast scale, even though it was never understood that. But the people who studied it, including the Soviets themselves, said, yeah, now these collective farmers, as a collectivity, not as an individual, but as a collectivity, receive the profits, whatever they might be on farming, and have the right to distribute that which they receive. So we have the establishment of communism across this vast territory. Last step on this. The state sent into every single collective party officials from Moscow and used local party officials across Russia. So two kinds of state officials, members of the Communist Party, CP. Members of the CP arrived, and those members of the CP attended the mandatory meetings in which this surplus was appropriated and distributed. Let me do it again. This is your exam you just took. It's one of the questions on the exam. Okay, so let me do it here. At those meetings, which, if you were 15 years old and above, you had to attend, you would receive legally and economically, you would receive, and you were understood culturally, to receive the profits of the collective. That was yours as a member of the collective, all across Russia. And you had then to distribute the surplus. But these party officials were given instructions from the state capitalists on how the surplus should be distributed. So you had power being wielded by these officials, telling the communist members of the collective how they should distribute the surplus. So let me do this. Okay? You have the establishment of communist collectives. So this is grain. So now the total value of grain is in communism. The collectivity receives the value of grain, minus the cost. So this is the C cost in communism. That's all the means of production used up, plus the surplus received by these communist workers, that has to be distributed. Communism. Then what's left over is the value, the wages received by the communist workers. And this was allocated by labor reform. Remember Lenin? That's what they had. That's what they did. You see, it really is. It's extraordinary. It's precisely what we read. So, the value you received as a worker was according to what you contributed to the collectivity. They took it right from Marx and from Lenin. Lenin's not there. He's on the stop. Here's what the party officials did now. So you had people coming from Moscow, and you had these local officials. The local officials, they lived at something that was established now in the 1930s. A new thing, a site was established in agriculture. It was called a machine tractor station, for short MTA. So across Russia, these MTAs were established, and the purpose of these was to place machine tractor stations, to place tractors on these locations, and the tractors were to be rented to the collectivities. And that officials on the machine tractor stations who were renting these tractors were also the same ones who participated in the meetings of the collectivities, in which the surplus was being appropriated and distributed by the members. So, officials came in from thousands of miles away, Moscow, and you had these local officials who were more knowledgeable of what was going on in their respective collectives. And they said to these farmers, look, you have to take care of the means of production that you use up. If you have 10 cows, and if one cow dies, you got to use a portion of this to replace that cow. What happens if we don't? We'll shoot you. But we'll deal with you very harshly. So that's using force to make sure the collective replaces the used up means of production. The collectivity was under orders on how the members of the collective were to allocate, to distribute the surplus that they received. A portion had to go for reserves. For what? For emergencies. If there was a bad weather, which hurt the harvest, then you had to have a reserve so you could continue for the next cropping season. You might say, that makes sense. That's right. It's not the point whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. This makes sense too. The point is that the communist officials are ordering the collectivity of how to distribute the surplus. A portion had to be given for health, education. What was this all about? They wanted the members of the collective to be healthy. Why? So that they could produce crops. They wanted them to have an education. Why? To increase their productivity. What? Music? Yes. To produce a more civilized life. They had that utopian dream too. And they used the force to make sure the surplus was allocated to nurses, doctors, teachers of music. Take a portion of that surplus, not only allocated the reserves, health, education, music, and so forth, etc., but also to rent a tractor from the machine tractor station. Why? To raise the productivity of labor on the collective, which will cheapen the unit value of food, which will reduce the value of labor power in industry, which will raise the surplus value, which will allow state capitalist industry to grow faster than it would otherwise. They soon discovered that in order to do all this, you needed managers on these collectives. People that could supervise and organize and direct all this. And say some of the people on the collectives had to be not just nurses and doctors and teachers and instructors of music and so forth, but also they had to be managers. So it's the problems, the things that we discussed. So a portion of the collective went to school a little bit, and they became managers to manage all of this, to make sure that the collective continued to thrive. Okay, let me not belabor it. You get an idea now. The state officials are putting pressure on these collectives to maintain the means of production, to maintain means of production, maintain a reserve, maintain health, education, and so forth, produce healthier mentally and physically communist workers, rent tractors, buy more other kinds of means of production, fuels and so forth, etc., accumulate more capital, pay your managers, and so forth. And so all of this kept increasing. Do your arithmetic. If this is increasing, if this stays the same, this is diminishing. If this is 100, and if this is 50, this is 50. If they keep putting pressures and make this 60, this is 100, oh, this becomes 40. The wages are falling. So, the state officials, coming from state capitalism, continually put pressure on the collectives all across the Soviet Union, and they were in the collectives to do this, to increase not just this depreciation, to maintain it, but also to increase all the time the subsumed class payments, which left less for consumption. Last step. We abolished private markets. We just got the state markets. And now the state set the only price, because this is now one price of grain. And what the state did was set the price of grain below the value of the grain. So the farmers had to sell at PG. They had no choice. There were no private markets, no private merchants. They had no choice. They had to sell at whatever the state set. And what happened was that the state set a price lower than the cost of producing grain. You see that? You're reducing this to 90. At the same time, you're increasing this. These farmers are going to face starvation. That's what happened in the 1930s. So, under communism, the state manipulated the terms of trade again, just like it had under NEP, to squeeze these communist collective farms even more than the ancients. The ironic twist across one of the ironic twists across the 20th century is that communism was established. It was unbelievably successful. And the very success of it enabled the state, on Stalin, to squeeze the success out of communism, to create a situation in which the state faced revolts across the rural area from the very collectives it had set up in 28, 29, 30. They were revolting because they faced starvation. And here's what Stalin did. He started to get letters from the collectives, which were published in the national newspaper called Pravda, P-R-A-V-D-A. So Pravda was the national newspaper, and everybody was quite democratic, could publish their letters there. That's what provided. So thousands of letters, you can read, were pouring into the national newspaper. They were published, in which people said, this continues. We're going to revolt. We're going to die before we... Unbelievable. And to solve that problem, Stalin, in the early 1930s, reintroduced the ancient class structure into agriculture and allowed those communist collectives to also, in addition to what they were doing under communism, to produce and sell ancient commodities on a private market, to eliminate the threat of a communist rebellion in a so-called communist society. I'll see you on Tuesday.